People's Platform.
Good evening and welcome to the People's Platform. My guest tonight is Subhashini Abeysinghe. She functions as the Research Director at Verite Research. Good evening and welcome to the show, Subhashini.
Good evening.
When we take a look at trade agreements, they are one of the key instruments in promoting trade, and we see the incumbent government actively pursuing and promoting trade agreements. Could you, to set the stage, take us through the advantages of trade agreements? Why are they so important? Because there's also a lot of misinformation and disinformation surrounding trade agreements.
Yes, so trade agreements are very important for countries who feel like they have a good basket of export products that are very competitive, but somehow their success abroad is somehow hindered by various barriers other countries impose on their exports. For example, one of the most common barriers that countries find is import taxes, right? Mm-hmm. So when you have to pay import taxes, sometimes you're made uncompetitive in comparison to the domestic producers, because domestic producers do not pay import taxes. And the other reason is Sri Lanka has been rather shy of signing trade agreements. Sri Lanka has to this date about 6 agreements it has signed. So in contrast, most of our competitor countries in Asian region have signed 10-20 agreements with multiple of our exporting countries.
Okay.
So as a result, they get duty-free access, for example, when we have to pay duties. So the idea is that you are discriminated at the border because you do not have an agreement. If these barriers are taken away and if you are given a fair playing field, actually you can do better in these export markets. And with that objective, many countries enter into trade agreements, and they hope that, okay, you can actually increase trade by doing so. And then the second reason that smaller countries like Sri Lanka especially enter trade agreements is, you have to attract export-oriented investments, but when you have a lot of countries that you have agreements with that provide duty-free access to products exported from your country, the idea is that it will make Sri Lanka an attractive destination for investments, that especially export-oriented investments. So the idea behind trade agreements for smaller countries like Sri Lanka is really market access and increase in foreign direct investments. So obviously these are give and take agreements, right?
Sure.
So for you to get market access into another country, obviously that country expects us to give market access to their products. So the idea is that means some of your domestic industries will see increased competition coming from abroad. Earlier, maybe you had a 30% cost advantage because there was a 30% import tax on imports. Now, under the agreement, maybe this 30% is going to be taken off, which means you have now more high price competition compared to before, right? So your domestic industry needs to also be prepared for increased competition in an agreement. And in generally, when you say advantages or costs and benefits, it really depends on the details of the agreement.
Right.
So when you analyze agreements, you will find not every trade agreement is actually free. Right? So
Okay.
although the name can be quite misleading, the name says free trade agreements, and you say, once the agreement is signed, the trade between the two countries becomes free. But in reality, it doesn't, right?
The devil is in the details.
The devil is in the details, and when you go into the details only, you will realize whether the country benefits or not, because it depends on how much the product and trade coverage, how much of your products and how much of your trade actually is covered by the agreement, and how deep the cuts are, like basically the tariff reduction, and how fast the reduction happens. Some countries may take 5 years to reduce, some countries may take 15 years to reduce, some countries may take 10 years to reduce. So how fast does the reduction happen? And then second, there is something called rules of origin. Basically, every product is not eligible. You have to meet certain conditions to be eligible. A good example is we signed a trade agreement with India, and one of our largest export products of Sri Lanka is apparel. accounts for 45% of Sri Lanka's total exports. But India said, when I say everything is not free, India said, actually, we can't allow complete duty-free access to apparel. Up to a quota, up to a certain quantity, we will allow duty-free access. So they said 8 million pieces. And then on top of that, they said that is still not everything produced in Sri Lanka gets duty-free access. Only apparel manufactured with Indian fabrics get duty-free access.
Right.
So at the time we signed the agreement, actually Sri Lankan apparel companies were hardly using Indian fabric in their production. So as a result, until Sri Lankan government negotiated for several years to get that rule relaxed and say apparel manufactured with textile imported from any country is eligible for concessions. Although there was 8 million pieces, we couldn't export.
Right. So we need better negotiators.
Better negotiators. Plus, yes, definitely better negotiators. But sometimes the trade agreements happen. You can become better negotiators. What we call in trade jargon, if your offensive interest is greater than your defensive interest. What do I mean? My offensive interest is actually there is greater interest, a large number of companies and producers interested in getting market access, as opposed to companies who want to protect their sector in the home. So it's about how many of the companies are domestic oriented and wants to be protected. They have defensive interests. They want to protect. So their objective in the trade negotiation is, I want protection in my sector. Offensive interests are also exporting companies, export-oriented companies who say, look, I don't care about the domestic market. I want foreign markets to open their doors for me, right? So when a country has a lot more offensive interest than defensive interest, you can be better negotiators because I said it's a give and take. So you can say, look, if you give me this access, I will give you access to this important product from your country to my country. But when you go with a lot of offensive interests, right? So they will say, okay, I'll give you access, but then you have to give access to mine. But for most of those requests, you may have to say, no, sorry, I can't.
Right.
Then your bargaining position is not that great.
Okay. Now, you spoke about some presumptions in order for Sri Lanka to actively pursue trade agreements. We need to have some prerequisites. We have to be competitive and we have to have a good basket of goods. Do we have that infrastructure in place?
Yes, so that's one of my main problems or concerns with the benefits, how much these trade agreements will benefit Sri Lanka. So normally when you are an exporter, you will face two sets of barriers. One is in your home country, right? So when you want to do a business, you need to import raw materials, machinery, inputs, and then you have to get various permits to import, and then you have to export. When you export also, you need a lot of approvals, and then you're subject to a lot of taxes, a lot of regulations. So these can become barriers if they cost you unnecessarily high amount, if you're going to spend a lot of time getting these approvals and this thing, and also if your regulations and taxes change all the time in an ad hoc manner, then it's very unpredictable environment. You can't decide on these unpredictable changes can affect your price. For example, if the government changes taxes very frequently in an ad hoc manner, especially trade taxes, which happens in Sri Lanka quite a lot, and then if you change regulations, it can affect your price competitiveness, it can affect your ability to meet buyer in terms of timely delivery. So all of these we call domestic barriers to trade, right? And then for external barriers to trade is what the importing country imposes. It can be various tariff barriers, again the permits, licenses, whatever they require if you want to enter my country. So the question is, if your domestic barriers are higher than your foreign country barriers, and the reason why your companies are not succeeding abroad or why they're not internationally competitive is largely because of Sri Lanka's government actually having imposed multiple barriers that impede ability of these firms to be successful, then no matter how many trade agreements you sign, you're not going to have significant impact, right? I'll take one example, because we recently signed an agreement with Thailand, right? So, East Asian countries, Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, all of these countries have done significantly better in exports than most South Asian countries, and especially Sri Lanka. So when you look at Thailand, you would see Thailand has about 15 trade agreements already signed, about another 15 that they're negotiating, right? Sri Lanka, in contrast, has only 6, and maybe with Thailand we have 7 agreements, right? And for the last 10 years, we've, when Singapore trade agreement was signed, it was after 10 years. So we've not signed a trade agreement for almost 10 years, right? So they're very active. But what you need to know is these countries are more active and more aggressive in reducing domestic barriers to trade. If you compare Thailand and Sri Lanka, so we call the trade facilitation means simplification, automation and streamlining of trade procedures and making them more transparent. So when you look at implementation of trade facilitation measures by Sri Lanka and Thailand, so we have something called the WTO Trade Facilitation Agreement. At the time this agreement was signed, Thailand said they are ready to implement 92% of the measures in that agreement. What does that mean? Actually, that means even before this agreement came into place, they had already worked on this, right? In contrast, Sri Lanka could implement only 31%. So you could see that countries like Thailand succeed because they actually worked very hard to make their, whatever barriers their companies face, to remove them. And another example is like basically there is an index that shows the freedom of, it is called Economic Freedom Index. So in Economic Freedom Index, there are different indicators. One measures how free a country to trade internationally.
Right.
So they rank countries, right? They have ranked 165 countries. Sri Lanka is 156.
No.
Right? And Thailand, the country we signed, is 8 and at the 80th position. So you see why Thai businesses succeed and why Sri Lanka fails, right? So while signing trade agreement is fine, but what the government needs to really, before asking foreign governments to reduce barriers for Sri Lankan exporters, I think Sri Lankan government needs to really focus on removing barriers for their own exporters imposed by them.
All right. On that note, we're going for a short commercial break. We'll be right back.
The People's Platform. මිනිසුන්ගේ මිනිස්කම් බිඳෙන මානව ධර්මතා නොරැකෙන සමාජයක මිනිසුන් උදෙසා මිනිස්කම රැකෙන ජීවිතේ වටිනාම අවශ්‍යතාවය පිරිසිදු වතුර බිඳක් රැකෙන ගම්මැද්ද ගලින් බිඳුණු වැවට කුඩ වූ වගයි.
Vision, Saturday 7:30 p.m.
ජනාධිපතිතුමාගේ විදිහට අපි ගොඩද
මේ ප්‍රතිපත්ති රාමුවත් මේකත් හිස් වූ රාමුවක්
නායකෙක්ට පුළුවන් අවශ්‍යයි නම් සංවේදීත් වෙලා ඒ වෙලාවෙම තාර්කිකත් වෙන්න.
ජානමය හේතුත් බලපාන්න පුළුවන් ද සමහර වෙලාවට මානසික තත්ත්ව වෙනස් වෙන්න.
මානසික රෝගයක් 80%ක් ජානගතයි. 20%ක් එන්වයරන්මන්ට් එකේ ඉන්නේ.
නින්දෙදිත් සිදුවෙන ශ්වසන අපහසුතාවන් පිළිබඳ අපිට වාර්තා වෙනවා. මේක ගොරවනකොට වැඩි වෙනවද?
නින්දේදී සිදුවන ශ්වසන අවහිරතාවය නැත්නම් අපි මේක හඳුන්වනවා මේ obstructive sleep apnea කියන තත්ත්වය.
ජාතික මෙහෙවර සතියේ දිනවල උදෑසන 11ට.
TV1 TV for life. Human Rights Watch says that Sri Lanka is going fast in reverse.
Sri Lanka supports establishing Palestinian state, President tells Israel minister. 2 massive Iranian warships reach Sea of Sri Lanka. Protest erupts in Gallawaya, demanding solution for human-elephant conflict. Deputy Director of the Colombo General Hospital forcefully confined to his office by minor staff.
TV1. TV for life.
Mysteries of the Ocean Floor. Sea of Sri Lanka. Tomorrow at 6:30 p.m. exclusively on TV1. The People's Platform.
Welcome back. My guest tonight is Research Director at Verite Research, Subhashini Abeysinghe. Subhashini, before the break, we were talking about the importance of trade agreements, myths surrounding trade agreements, how to move forward with trade agreements. There is a heavy focus on entering into trade agreements with countries in the Asian region. How significant is it for Sri Lanka to succeed in the Asian market, given the fact that we have been borrowing continuously from countries like China, India, Japan, but these are massive export markets. Why aren't we earning foreign exchange from these countries? Why are we just borrowing foreign exchange from them?
Yes, so that's one of the main reasons why Sri Lankan exports have failed in the last maybe 2 decades, right? Sri Lanka's exports have recorded very, very slow growth, and as a percentage of GDP, we've seen a substantial decline from around 30% in 2000 to around half of that by now, right? So this is in contrast to the countries that you said that has really seen a rapid increase in their exports. And also a rapid increase in their imports, because Asian region has been one of the fastest growing regions, and it still is, right? And first it started with Japan, and then China, and now we are thinking, everybody is talking about India, right, as one of the fastest growing countries in the world. So that means these are massive markets that are opening up in our neighborhood. We import quite a lot from these countries. China and India alone account for 50% of Sri Lanka's imports, right? About 40% of Sri Lanka's imports. But we hardly export to these countries. Not even 10% of Sri Lanka's exports go to these countries. So the question to ask is, why? Because in contrast, most of these countries have increased trade among themselves, right? Okay. A lot of East Asian countries have successfully exported to China, to the extent that in most of these countries, China is among their top 3 export destinations, right? And that is where most of the growth has come from. But like you said, Sri Lanka has massively borrowed from China, but hardly exported to China, right? And what is really important to understand is we missed one major trend in the world that we call basically emergence of global value chains. That is, all of these products like electronics, automobiles, where the production got fragmented across multiple countries, where trade in parts and components became very important. So you have trade parts and components being made in different countries and assembled in another country. That the famous example everyone quotes is Apple mobile phone, because it's made, the parts of which is made in multiple countries, right? So Sri Lanka missed that entire wave of global value chains because of two reasons. One is global value chains are driven by foreign direct investments. In Vietnam, it was investment by Samsung. Thailand became a major exporter of automobiles because Japanese car manufacturers went and invested in Thailand. So we all know China also started with a lot of foreign investments in the West, right? Apple and everyone. Now they are, because of the tensions, now they're trying to see, can I find other destinations, right? But Sri Lanka failed to attract investments, export-oriented investments, for many reasons that I said earlier, right? If you want to become an export-oriented investor, you want to make sure that time and cost of trading across borders, where you can bring in components, add value and export, the time and cost and predictability are critical to succeed in value chains. So no major global firm would consider Sri Lanka a location to invest unless they are assured that the time and cost and predictability of my parts and components coming to the next factory to start manufacturing is something that can be guaranteed, right? So even today, no matter, it is really good that we are signing agreements with Asia, and we realized that one of the things that we missed is integrating with the Asian markets and joining Asian value chains. But what we need to understand, again to emphasize the previous point, is that actually you need to really reduce the cost of doing business and trading across borders. A good example is in these regions, trade in electronic components and automobile components account for good 30-40% of exports of these countries. What is the share of that in Sri Lanka? It's less than 10%. So also that means if you look at Thailand agreement, one of the reasons why I am skeptical about that agreement is, look, one of the major imports of Thailand is also electronic equipment and parts. That's because in order to add value, you import parts, right? But and around 70% of electronic parts and components is already duty free. Even before the agreement was signed, was duty free to Sri Lanka. So about 31% of the products, which is around 3,000 products, and which account for about 56% of Thailand's imports, was already free.
Oh, wow.
Right?
Okay.
See, this is before the agreement was signed. So the fact that we could not succeed, we can't say it is necessarily because of trade barriers imposed by Thailand. It is more likely it is because of trade barriers we have and investment barriers we have that prevents us from succeeding.
In terms of our Sri Lankan businesses, what must the government do to enable ease of doing business? We spoke about this at the inception of the conversation, but to wrap up the show, I'd like to ask you, we're dealing with corruption vulnerabilities, maladministration, political issues, so many moving parts that Sri Lanka is dealing with, debt restructuring, the IMF supported program, all of these things happening, but it is incumbent that the government also ensures that businesses are able to do business with ease.
So actually what we lack is we are fully aware of the problem and we've had plans, proposals for a long time. So where we lack is really speed of implementation, which is blocked a lot by vested interests. I will give you one example. So one of the ways today everyone makes doing business easy is by adopting technology, right? By automating. You don't need to physically go to government agencies anymore. You don't need to physically fill paper paper documents anymore. And when you reduce people to people physical interactions, that also reduces room for corruption, right? So one of the ways that everyone tries, we say, is okay, you streamline, simplify and automate the export-import processes. And Singapore is one of the first to automate and create this one they call a single window, where all government agencies and traders can talk to each other through one portal, right? So they completed it in 1989. And Sri Lanka actually started the process of automating not much later, right? In around early 1990s, we started a project called Electronic Data Interchange System exactly to automate our board agencies. It has been 30 years from 1993 to now. Where have we gone?
Oh my God.
Right?
Okay.
Many other countries that started this process way before us really have made far more progress, right? We've had multiple assistance by various development partners from World Bank to others, and we've done blueprints on single window, but somehow Sri Lanka is so bad in implementation. So if the government is really serious about making exports succeed, about making Sri Lanka an attractive destination for investments, what we must do is actually implement what is already on the table.
All right, fabulous. This was such a comprehensive set of explanations. Thank you so much, Subhashini Abeysinghe, for joining us.
Thank you very much for inviting.
Thank you for watching us. We'll see you again next week. Good night.